Hi everyone, welcome to another day of Bible study. Today we're in 1 Chronicles chapter 5. 1 Chronicles 5, and there's a free PDF on our website if you want it. Let's talk about our timeline first of all. 1 Chronicles is primarily about the reign of King David that lasted from about 1055 to 1015 BC. It's about 40 years. Chapters 10 through the last chapter of the book, I think there's 29, that covers that 40-year span. The first 9 chapters are mostly about genealogies that we've been talking about. Now, I do want to make mention of one other date or dates as we get into this. It's just going to be briefly mentioned in the chapter. You don't have to memorize it or anything. But the Assyrian Empire sent a portion of the nation of Israel into exile around 740 to 730 BC, somewhere within there. And then they later returned and sent the entire nation into exile in 721 BC. So that's about 200 years after the life of David. Just going to briefly mention that. Now, this is another genealogy chapter. We're talking about some of the sons of Jacob, or Israel, and their children. So we're going to talk about Reuben, who was Jacob's oldest son, Gad, Jacob's son by Leah's servant named Zilpah, Manasseh. Manasseh was actually Joseph's son, but was adopted by Joseph's father, Jacob. And finally, the Assyrians. They were an empire that rose to world prominence in the centuries following the reign of David and Solomon. Now to our map. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, which we'll talk about in this chapter, lived on the east side of the Jordan River. Moses gave them that land after they made a special request to him. Most of the tribes lived on the west side, but these 3 lived on the east. Now the capital of the Assyrian Empire was Nineveh, which is not on the map. It's way up to the northeast, about 550 miles from Jerusalem. When the Assyrians came in and exiled the people of Israel, they scattered them throughout their empire, which was a vast area of land. Over to page number 2 now, we'll talk about our first section of the chapter, which is the Descendants of Reuben, verses 1 through 10. Reuben was Jacob's oldest son, but he didn't receive the benefits, the birthright that the oldest son generally received because he did something dishonorable. His crime was that he, quote, defiled his father's couch, which most likely refers to the time when Reuben slept with one of his father's concubines named Bilhah. You read about that story in Genesis 35, and there's a reference to it in chapter 49, verse 4 as well. So Reuben's birthright was given to the sons of Joseph. So these verses document the descendants of Reuben leading up to that time when they were exiled by the Assyrians. Section number 2, the descendants of Gad, verses 11 through 22. So this section contains a genealogy of the children of Gad, the descendants of Gad. The Gadites lived to the north of the Reubenites on the east side of the Jordan River. You can see that on the grayed out sections on the map. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh are said to have fought several groups of people. The Haggites, Jeter, Naphish, and Nodab, and they took considerable possessions from these people, and they took their land as well. Now for our final section, verses 23 through 26, the chiefs of the half-tribe of Manasseh. Half the tribe of Manasseh lived on the west side of the Jordan River, half of them lived on the east side. We're going to be focused on those who lived on the east side, to the north of the territory of the Gadites. The leading men of that half-tribe are listed in verse 24. Hopefully you've seen that if you've read the chapter. Now we are told that, unfortunately, the people of Gad, Reuben, and half the tribe of Manasseh didn't obey God. They didn't keep God's law. They, quote, broke faith, and they started worshiping false idols, which Moses had strictly forbidden them from doing. As a consequence of their unfaithfulness, God allowed the Assyrian Empire to come and to exile them from their land. But keep in mind, that's not for another couple hundred years after David, who we're going to be focused on in 1 Chronicles. So there you have it, 1 Chronicles chapter 5. Thanks for joining us for our study today. We do have an application, though, before we finish. One deterrent to sin is to think generationally about the effects that your sin can have on your family in the future. We've probably all known families whose reputations have been generationally shamed because of the sins of one of its members. Reuben's sin may have brought him some momentary pleasure, but in the long term it cost his family. His family lost the birthright, and they always kind of had that hanging over the head of their ancestor that he had committed this sin and therefore kind of been demoted in the family of Jacob. So the application for us is your sins can tarnish your family's reputation, and they can result in your children having to work harder to escape the disgrace that you've attached to them. So think about that before you give yourself the green light to sin.